Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into the reality behind one of history's absolute biggest icons, Cleopatra. For centuries, pop culture has kind of boxed her in, right? Painting her as this tragic, romantic figure, someone defined basically by dramatic love affairs and legendary beauty. But the actual historical record, it tells a completely different story. We're talking about a fiercely brilliant strategist, an unparalleled intellectual, and the ultimate architect of her own image. So let's strip away the Hollywood myth and meet the real, multifaceted Cleopatra. Right out of the gate, we've got to confront a historical reality that still catches a lot of people off guard. When you picture the grand, sprawling history of ancient Egypt, she is literally the final chapter. But here's the twist. Egypt's last pharaoh actually was an Egyptian. Seriously, let that sink in for a second. The woman who is practically synonymous with the very idea of Egypt, the face of its ancient empire for most of us today, possessed a completely different heritage. So how does that even happen? Well, to figure that out, we have to rewind a bit and trace the actual origins of her power, her bloodline. And let me tell you, this was not a family tree rooted in the sands of the Nile. This was a bloodline of conquerors. It was a dynasty forged entirely through military expansion and absolute unchecked power. And that brings us to the central irony of her entire reign. She held the absolute, undeniable title, ruler of Egypt. She was the final sovereign of a kingdom that had been around for thousands of years. Yet her actual heritage, something else entirely. She was of Greek descent. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was a Greek royal family that had basically been running Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. To get the full picture, we have to look back at a guy named Ptolemy I. He wasn't Egyptian royalty at all. He was actually one of Alexander the Great's top generals. After Alexander died, Ptolemy swooped in, seized control of Egypt, and, well, just declared himself pharaoh. As our source material somewhat dryly points out, declaring yourself a god king isn't exactly a democratic move. But that unilateral power grab is exactly what established the dynasty that eventually produced Cleopatra. But her Greek bloodline really is only half the story. While her ancestors relied heavily on sheer military might to hold on to the throne, Cleopatra, she was playing chess while they were playing checkers. She knew that true, lasting power took something way more sophisticated. She couldn't just rule Egypt from an ivory tower. She had to become the very voice of Egypt. She totally pivoted her dynasty's approach from pure physical conquest to immense intellectual power and mastery of communication. And that brings us to the number 9. It's a simple number, sure, but it represents an incredibly complex, brilliant mind. See, Cleopatra wasn't just relying on a small army of translators to run her empire. She was phenomenally educated and remarkably fluent. She spoke 9 different languages. 9. This wasn't just some casual hobby. This was the ultimate tool for a master political strategist. She could negotiate, command, and persuade vast, diverse populations entirely in their native tongues. Out of those 9 languages, she was fully fluent in Egyptian, her native Greek, and Latin. Just think about the massive geopolitical advantage that gave her, especially when dealing with the rising superpower of Rome. Bouncing between Greek, Latin, and Egyptian requires serious mental agility. With a linguistic toolkit like that, she could out-negotiate the most powerful men in the ancient world, and she never once needed a middleman. Honestly, she probably would have been absolutely amazing at tongue twisters. Because of this, she achieved a monumental historical milestone. She became the very first Ptolemaic pharaoh to actually learn the Egyptian language. Think about that for a second. For nearly 300 years, her Greek ancestors had ruled Egypt without ever bothering to learn the language of the people they were governing. Cleopatra finally broke that cycle. And this wasn't just some academic gold star, it was a massive, highly calculated political statement. By speaking Egyptian, she connected directly with her populace in a way no ruler from her family ever had before. She literally made herself one of them. But here's the thing. Her formidable intellect was just one weapon in her arsenal. She also completely understood the psychology of power. She didn't just master language, she mastered personal branding. She cultivated an aura that was so intoxicating it quite literally became the scent of legend. You see, pop culture is obsessed with her physical beauty. That's the part of the myth Hollywood absolutely refuses to let go of. But to the people who actually stood in her presence, she was truly defined by her fragrance. Cleopatra realized early on that presentation and sensory impact were incredible tools of power. She didn't just want to be seen, she wanted her presence to linger in a room long, long after she had walked out. So she deliberately crafted a signature perfume to elevate her legendary status. And we actually know what went into it. She would blend cinnamon, rose, and myrrh to create this bespoke perfume. It was spicy, it was floral, and deeply earthy. It reads almost like a modern high-end fragrance recipe, right? But back then, this was a scent meticulously designed to make her history feel wonderfully, intimately tangible. It was, quite literally, the scent of absolute authority. Of course, every dramatic story has to come to an end, and Cleopatra's final chapter is easily the most famous and definitely the most mysterious part of her entire legacy. We really need to look at her debated demise because it's a historical puzzle that is still baffling scholars to this very day. It's the question that has echoed through the centuries. Did an asp really end it all? You know the legendary story. Facing total defeat by Rome, she supposedly chose to end her own life by letting a venomous snake, an asp, bite her. It is such a wildly dramatic, highly theatrical image, and it's been immortalized in countless paintings and plays. But is it actually true? Let's separate the facts from the fiction here. The legend insists she used an asp to commit suicide and was subsequently buried alongside her famous Roman lover, Mark Antony, in a magnificent, grand tomb. The reality? Well, these specific events are hotly debated by historians right now. The exact method of her death and the true undiscovered location of that tomb remain massive historical question marks. Pop culture essentially takes the romanticized tale as undeniable fact, but historians are still actively arguing over what really went down in those final days. Which brings us to a pretty fascinating conclusion. If the very final moments of her life are still shrouded in this much uncertainty, it really begs a vital question. What else about Egypt's last pharaoh is just a myth? As we've seen in this explainer, her heritage was actually Greek, and her legendary allure was fueled way more by calculated intellect than simply her looks. It really leaves you wondering, how much of history is just a convenient story we've all agreed to tell, and how much is still waiting out there in the dark, just waiting to be uncovered? Thank you so